Hello and welcome back to World Traveler Commentary. Now, I'm not in my normal place because, well, I'm moving, so I'm somewhere temporary at the moment. But I wanted to talk about the threat of nuclear escalation in the Ukraine conflict and what I think the West needs to keep in mind in deciding how big this risk actually is and also how to respond to it should things escalate and nuclear weapons be used at some point in the conflict. And I'm bringing this up because, of course, very recently Ukraine has asked the United States to threaten Russia with nuclear response if Russia were to indicate that they were likely to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I think the wording that I saw was even thinks about, which supposes something like a first strike by the United States. I think that's, for various reasons, should be completely off the table. I think people usually neglect to think about the fact that a nuclear war, significant exchange between two nuclear armed countries, would kill billions of people. Including in areas far from the conflict zone. So you don't just have to think about the people who are going to be vaporized by the weapons themselves. You also have to worry about the people in China, India, Africa, etc., who will starve to death as a result of failed agriculture around the world. And so I am 100% opposed to nuclear escalation by the United States and other nuclear powers here. And I also think that the overall threat of nuclear escalation is something which Russia, if they are sane, will completely avoid doing for reasons that go into the developing geopolitics of this war. Now, one thing that Putin has done an extraordinarily good job at in this war has been creating a West versus South dynamic that prevents Russia from being significantly economically isolated throughout the world. Russia is effectively denied Western goods, but they're not denied natural resources or exports of natural resources generally, either on the import or the export side, and they're not really denied many of the things that they actually need in order to reindustrialize and bring some industries, such as aircraft manufacturing, back in-house. So the reason I'm bringing this up is that while we see over and over in the Western press, and I think it's really important to recognize that no matter which side you listen to, both Russian and pro-Russian sources and Western and pro-Western sources are heavily propagandizing this war. And so figuring out what is actually going on requires a broader set of sources than one side's media is able to provide. Requires a broader sense than even both sides' media is capable of providing together. Okay, so a lot of things I'm looking at are reactions by people I know in the global South, around the global South, watching the political implications of what's going on in places like Brazil and things like that, because you can get a better sense of the geopolitics of what's going on if you actually pay attention to those as primary sources. So you have this big West versus South dynamic that's happening. And basically what this means is that Russia's doing fine as far as exports. They're limited as far as imports, and this hurts them in certain industries very badly. Particularly civil aviation is going to suffer significantly for the foreseeable future. But many other things like being able to produce military goods or produce food or export food. Those things are going really well. In fact, Africa as a whole appears to have moved very, very much into Russia's court when it comes to grain purchases. Part of this was due to disruption of Ukrainian supplies, but I think another part of it is this West versus South dynamic, and consequently the idea that, sorry about that, I have no idea why that cable fell down there, but particularly the idea that, well, if the West wants Africa to move one direction, Africa is going to move the other direction. There's a lot of painful, difficult history there. And there's a lot of painful, difficult recent history there, in particular in areas like COVID vaccine availability and things like that. Africa's been on the receiving end of a lot of structural violence from the West. Countries ranging from the United States to Germany, France, pretty much all Western countries. That doesn't discount structural violence from China in some cases, or the Middle East, which also happens in Africa, but it doesn't have the long and biting history that Western structural violence does. And so people there have a tendency of overlooking it more. So when Putin says this is a fight against the collective West, he's trying to rally support from the global South. And this is very important as we get into the possibilities of nuclear escalation. I'll go over a couple of different ways in which things could develop and what I think the response needs to be. But if we don't start from the idea that there is this West versus South dynamic, and that the West has, even through this war, continued to push structural violence on the global South, that it's really not surprising that the global South is moving in Russia's direction. Okay. So the big thing about this is the use of nuclear weapons would change that dynamic in some really important ways. If you have an exchange of nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, or even between the United States and France, or even between Russia and France, or between Russia and the United Kingdom, you would have the possibility that agriculture would fail in much of the world. Billions of people would starve to death as a result. So, for this reason, nuclear retaliation as an option needs to be kept as small as possible. In other words, I don't read Article 5 of NATO as requiring a retaliation of a nuclear attack for a nuclear attack, for example. If a strategic nuclear weapon were to hit Warsaw, for example, I think my reading of Article 5 is that countries would have a lot of flexibility in terms of how to respond, and nuclear-armed countries wouldn't have to use nuclear weapons to respond. But the other side to this is that a key aspect of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the conventions, international conventions around that, are that many countries opt not to produce nuclear weapons, and thus the overall expectation is that they won't be on the receiving end of nuclear nuclear weapons. So that's another dynamic here. The use of nuclear weapons against a Ukrainian target, for example, a tactical nuke aimed at major troop buildup or something like that, would be dramatically threatening to most of the world. Okay, and especially if you don't have Western promises of retaliation or things like that, it would be very, 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 very hard for Russia to continue the West versus South dynamic in a case where people are now suddenly worried that agriculture is going to fail as a result of the nuclear war. So my response on this is, in the event where, for example, that there is some sort of a nuclear attack on Ukraine, the correct response is a diplomatic response, it's not a military response. And the diplomatic response would focus on countries, including India and China, but also African countries, Latin American countries, and it would basically say Russia's crossed a massive red line, and therefore everybody needs to cease non-essential trade with the country. And this would be a dynamic change from this current situation where only a very small part of the world is in fact sanctioning Russia. I think it would be in fact quite possible, at least looking at the dynamics of the war so far, to that Russia would end up completely economically isolated if they were to actually use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. So this brings up a second possibility, which is in some ways scarier and harder to deal with, but in other ways I think could be responded to in much more or less the same way, and that would be if Russia were to launch a nuclear weapon and detonate it basically around the altitude of low Earth orbit, near the Russian-Ukrainian border. Now, if Russia were to do this, it would destroy all satellites immediately within a line of sight. So this would reduce the number of spy satellites in orbit by any country, for example, and it would. And it would disrupt, it would destroy many other military-oriented satellites. This would be not due to a shockwave or physical damage, it would be due to intense X-ray radiation. But it would do something else. We know this from tests in the 1960s, before we had so many satellites in orbit. A nuclear blast in the vicinity of low Earth orbit adds a massive amount of radiation to the Van Allen belts. And this will cripple or destroy all commercial satellites in low Earth orbit over the coming days. In fact, any satellite that is launched shortly after such an attack would still be seriously damaged or destroyed by the residual effects of the Van Allen belt fortification. Military satellites would probably fare a little better, but they too would probably suffer significant damage. Such an attack, consequently, would take out all commercial satellites in low Earth orbit, would destroy Starlink, it would destroy a large number of military satellites in orbit. Presumably things like GPS might fail. And it would continue to damage and degrade all satellites in low Earth orbit. I don't know what the impact is for those in geosynchronous orbit. Those are quite a ways further, and since things move out in 3 dimensions, I would expect the X-ray intensity to be low enough that it might not be such of a problem at that distance. But that's a problem. Now, what would a proper response to that be? Obviously, you can't respond to, oh, they destroyed our satellites with, we have to retaliate against their cities, right? And you can't retaliate in the same way because you're just going to make your own problem worse, right? So I think in a case like that, the solution needs to be diplomatic, and the message that would need to be sent is that by damaging a lot of these early warning satellites, it makes it much harder for the United States to track Russian ballistic missile launches, and this makes it far more likely that we could end up in an accidental nuclear war. And pitching this to the global south might also have an effect there. But my overall point here is that what's keeping Russia afloat right now is that the West doesn't have credibility with the global south. The global south realizes that they get the short end of every deal with the West. And the global south is hoping that this war leads to an end of Western hegemony. So am I, but I think it will, regardless of who wins the war on the ground. But the escalation of something to nuclear weapons would alarm people who are, and countries that are currently moving in Russia's direction enough that this would change the whole geopolitical dynamic of the war. It would provide an opportunity to actually tie Russia's hands economically, which, by the way, right now they're not. I mean, car repairs might have to rely on smuggled parts right now, right? Aircraft are a problem, but it's not like Russia doesn't have close ties with China. If you want to fly from Vladivostok to Moscow, well, if it has to transit in Beijing, that's annoying, but it's still possible, right? Other things like trains, trains, submarines, that sort of thing, missiles. Russia can produce all the components that it needs for that. Their integrated chip or computer chip manufacturing is, I think, about 15 years behind that of the West, but that's good enough for most of these applications. But a lot of this depends upon trade and foreign trade and being able to keep up foreign currency reserves in this sort of case. In the event where Russia were actually economically isolated, that would change. If you could pry China and India and Africa and South Asia and Latin America out of their current cheerleading for Russia against the West in this, then that would change things a lot. I don't think it would save Western hegemony. I think Western hegemony is going away, but it would change the dynamics of the war. So basically, what I'm trying to say here on the whole is that the geopolitical dynamics of this war are such that for all of the rhetoric, I think the risk of a nuclear escalation directly is relatively low, primarily because the cost to Russia would be unreasonably high. And I think that this can be continued to be kept high just by awareness of the geopolitical patterns that are happening in the war. And, I think that when there are statements made to the effect of, we would consider, nuclear deterrence in this case, it makes sense to be talking to everybody, other countries now, and simply say, we hope that you agree with us that if there were a nuclear first strike of any sort, including one in space, that this would be a serious threat to everybody on the planet. It would undermine the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It would change the whole global. It would threaten global food supplies. Many other things like this. I think that this sort of pressure could have a massive effect. So I think that that's where the focus needs to be. I don't think rhetoric on extending America's nuclear shield to Ukraine is particularly helpful. In fact, I think it's very unhelpful. If that were to happen, then the West versus South dynamics could be continued in the event of a nuclear attack against Ukraine, and the United States would then be forced to either respond or acknowledge that this was all a bluff, in which case the idea that NATO is covered would also be effectively called as a bluff. Neither of those situations are good. And consequently, I think that threatening nuclear retaliation to Russia actually makes a nuclear attack more likely. So that's all I have for you today. Hope you enjoy it, and talk to you soon.